work of Robert Frost, the 20th century American poet who gave us such treasures as The Road Not Taken and Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. One of Frost's most famous poems is entitled The Mending Wall. In it, two men, the poem's speaker and his neighbor, meet at the boundary between their respective properties to repair an old stone wall that separates their two estates. This work of repair, the speaker tells us, is a ritual the men repeat on a regular basis. Whenever the wall suffers damage, when the wear and tear of snow and sunshine, or the recklessness of local hunters and their dogs, or the tampering of woodland animals knocks the stones down, the two men meet at the wall and lift the heavy stones back into place, filling in the gaps and reestablishing the boundary between their lands and their lives. We keep the wall between us, the speaker says, to each the boulders that have fallen to each. And yet, even as he lifts one heavy boulder after another onto his shoulders, the speaker wonders why he's doing what he's doing. Why does the wall exist? What purpose does it serve? Why does he persist in separating himself from his fellow human beings, even when it seems there is something out there, something in the elements and maybe even in the earth itself that does not love a wall? When the speaker asks the other man his questions, the man replies, "Good fences make good neighbors." The speaker doesn't argue, but deep in his soul, the questions persist. Why build a wall? Why maintain it? I'd like to know, he says, what I am walling in and what I am walling out. Because there is something that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down. In our gospel reading this morning, Jesus tells the story of two men who live on either side of a wall, or more specifically in this case, a gate. On one side lives the rich man, an affluent member of society dressed in royal purple and fine linen, who feasts sumptuously in his luxurious house day after day. On the other side, out on the street, unhoused and starving, lives a man named Lazarus. He's covered in open sores, and his only companions are the dogs who lick his wounds. According to the text, this man spends his days longing in vain for a mere crumb or two from the rich man's table. You might be hard-pressed to read this story and see anything in it but judgment. To see, for example, an invitation, an offer of a deeper and more meaningful life, a life free of walls, a life of liberation, communion, and joy. But the invitation is there. Let's listen for it together. Like many of Jesus' parables, this one relies on extremes to make its point. The unnamed rich man in the story is obscenely rich. Lazarus, the poor man, whose name in Hebrew means God will help, is abjectly and viscerally poor. The gate that separates them in life, a gate built of privilege and wealth, is thick and formidable. While the two men live, the gate remains crossable. The rich man can dismantle it if he chooses to. In death, however, that same gate becomes a chasm that cannot be crossed. Because, Jesus implies, the time to do justice, the time to prioritize neighbor over wealth and love over complacency will not last forever. The time for mercy is now. The time to tear down the walls that insulate us from reality is now. This isn't an easy story. It doesn't mince words about what's at stake. It doesn't pretend that our years are limitless and our options infinite. Rather, it asks us very explicitly to examine what we love, what we care about, what we're willing to risk, and what we'll work the hardest to protect when push comes to shove. What do we routinely wall out of our gated lives, and what do we wall in? On its face, the parable is about wealth and privilege and excess. In fact, Jesus addresses the story to a group of people who have just ridiculed him for insisting that human beings cannot serve two masters at once. No matter how hard you try, Jesus tells them, you cannot serve both God and money. You cannot love both God and money. Your love for one will inevitably diminish and distort your love for the other. His listeners laugh. So Jesus responds with this story. There is much to say about the place of wealth in the life of faith. But the message that reverberates for me in this story of Lazarus and the rich man is a message about seeing. About seeing what our wealth obscures, seeing what our privilege renders invisible, seeing the people outside our gates not as strangers, not as threats, not as objects of pity or condescension, but as children of God, worthy of the same dignity, honor, and equity we desire for ourselves. If you look carefully at the text, you'll notice that the rich man is never described as cruel or evil. He doesn't abuse or enslave Lazarus. He doesn't chase him away or call the cops on him. In fact, it's possible that the rich man notices Lazarus every time he leaves or re-enters his home. Maybe, let's give him some credit, he tosses Lazarus the occasional coin, or agonizes, as I do, over whether it's good social policy or bad social policy to give cash to the unhoused. Maybe he theorizes about what kind of poor Lazarus is, deserving or undeserving. Maybe the rich man says a prayer for Lazarus on the Sabbath. Maybe, when he's with his friends, he brings up the poor as a problem to admire and initiates invigoratingly abstract conversations about the lower classes over dinner. I don't mean for one moment to be flippant or judgmental. I implicate myself fully in the dynamic I'm describing. Perhaps like many of you, I struggle with my own social location every time I read what Jesus has to say about money. I struggle because I'm a citizen of the United States, the wealthiest nation on earth. I struggle because I live in affluent Silicon Valley. I struggle because I have been given so many advantages, educational, cultural, emotional, and economic, simply by virtue of the family I was born into and the circumstances I happened to grow up in. And I struggle because a culture that surrounds me so often renders the suffering of my neighbors invisible, and the option of denial or apathy so easy. I don't live in a culture that encourages me to see outside the gate, to look closely and tenderly at the unhoused woman sitting on the street corner, to think about sweatshops when I buy my favorite clothes at Stanford Mall, to ponder the cruelties of factory farming as I fill my grocery cart at Trader Joe's, to remember burning forests, starving polar bears, melting glaciers, and polluted oceans every time I step into my car. But if the way of Christ is countercultural, then the question we have to ask is this: will we dare to see, not through our culture's eyes, but through God's eyes? Can we learn not to wallow in guilt over our privilege, but to steward it faithfully for the sake of love? Can we find the courage to tear down our walls and trust that God's Spirit will meet us with every kind of grace and abundance when we cross the chasm and embrace our neighbors as kin? To truly see Lazarus, the rich man in Jesus' parable has to recognize his own complicity in the man's suffering. He needs to understand that his incapacity to grieve and rage on behalf of his neighbor is a fatal sign of his own impoverishment. An impoverishment so total, no amount of linen, purple cloth, or fancy food can remedy it. In the same way, the kind of seeing Jesus calls us to is radical. It's vulnerable making. It's costly. It requires us to choose solidarity over security. It requires us to recognize in our wounded neighbors our own faces, our own pain, our own mortality. I know as I stand here this morning that we at St. Mark's are a community committed to living out the teachings of Jesus. We want to love. We want to serve. We want to work for justice and inclusion. At the very least, we want to tear down the walls that buffer us. The fact is, it is not always cold-heartedness or apathy that keeps our gates up and our eyes averted. It's fear. It's fatigue. It's distraction. And maybe it's even despair. It's the overwhelming sense that there is just too much need out there. Too many hurting people, too many toxic circumstances, too much entrenched injustice to ever overcome. Maybe it is also the knowledge that honest, invested seeing hurts. Because yes, it hurts to keep our hearts open to the world's pain. It hurts to open the gates that have kept us safely insulated for most of our lives. It hurts to acknowledge that we have looked away while others have sat at the gate, longing for crumbs. It hurts to realize that our carefully constructed walls have become our prisons. So what can we do? How shall we live? One of the disadvantages of using a lectionary is that we only hear the scriptures in small snippets. Snippets are fine as far as they go, but really, we need to take in and absorb the whole arc of God's Word to see that it truly is good news. To see that God asks nothing of us that God has not done already. To see that in the paradoxical nature of God's kingdom, sacrificial love, even when it hurts, leads to the fullest and most joyful kind of life. To see that resurrection always awaits us on the other side of the gate. If we walk away from today's gospel thinking that somehow by our own efforts, by our own sweat and blood and tears, we have to conjure up the courage to tear down our walls, we have to manufacture the love that breaks open our hearts, we have to stir up the moral urgency to bridge the chasms that lie in front of us, then yes, we will despair. We will give up. Because there is no way we can do this on our own. But here is the good news and the invitation. We are not meant to do this on our own. The call of God on our lives is not about gritted teeth and clenched fists and sheer willpower. The call of God on our lives is rooted in an astonishing promise. The promise that if we open our whole lives to the love and power of the risen Christ, if we give the servant king permission to reign in our hearts, then God's own love will flow in unspeakable abundance through us. We will never have to conjure it ourselves, because the Spirit who is love will fill us to overflowing, transforming us from the inside, gently but persistently taking down the stones we erect and the walls we cling to, giving us eyes to see and hearts to love, until compassion becomes not a moral duty, not an ethical obligation, not even a spiritual practice, but simply who we are at our core, God's people, Christ's followers, the beloved community. There is something there is someone who does not love the wall, who wants it down. Will we listen to his holy someone? Will we see what he sees and love what she loves? May we seek the grace to do so